Welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. With this work, we commemorate their lives and achievements. On the heels of our June 1st event about the Berlin-born artist Charlotte Salomon, who was murdered in 1943 by the German Nazis in Auschwitz, we gather today to celebrate the digital release of the animated film Charlotte. But before we do that, I need to appeal to you. Please consider becoming part of our summer campaign, which is officially starting tomorrow. Your support makes our work possible. Thank you. I'm now honored to introduce the film's producer, Julia Rosenberg, and Dr. Ori Z Soltes from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., who will discuss the animated film Charlotte and Julia's motivation, thoughts, and decisions that went into the creation of the film. Over her 25-year career, Julia Rosenberg has been one of Canada's top executives and producers. After 18 months as a feature film executive at Alliance Communications Corporation, she was the only executive who moved with Robert Lantis to his new venture, Serendipity Point Films. From 1998 through 2004, Julia oversaw all development and production there, during which time 8 features and 1 series were greenlit, among them being Julia, starring Annette Bening. In 2005, she launched January Films, where she has produced award-winning features and documentaries, most recently Charlotte, an animated feature for adults starring Keira Knightley that premiered the English version at TIFF 2021 and the French version at Annecy 2022. Drawing on her relationships at home and abroad, Julia has produced with the best of Canadian and international talent, executives, and financing. Dr. Ori Z Soltes teaches at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., across the disciplines of theology, art, history, philosophy, and politics. He's the former director and curator of the Bnei Brit Klutznik National Jewish Museum, where he curated some 80 exhibitions. He's the author of several hundred articles and catalog essays, and the author or editor of 25 books, including The Ashen Rainbow, The Holocaust and the Arts, Symbols of Faith, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draw from the Same Source, and Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture. The second edition of that book is forthcoming. Welcome, Julia and Ori, and I give over to Ori. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for being here. It is a true pleasure to be able to have a bit of a dialogue with Julia, having seen her wonderful film, and I'm assuming that most of you have seen the trailer. That said, I'm about to show it to you nonetheless, and then we'll see where we go from there, if I may, and that should be here. And are you all, hold on, are you all seeing the screen?
Nope.
Okay, then let's do it this way. Are you all seeing the screen now?
Yes.
All right, here we go. Hopefully it plays properly.
Do you paint happy moments or just the sad ones?
The sad ones always feel more true.
What is the function of art? Not deform what is already perfect.
How can that be taught? Maybe not taught, but learned.
Are you an artist?
Drawing is more of a hobby for Charlotte.
Miss Salomon, I'm sure you appreciate how competitive our school is. There is the unfortunate matter of your race.
One of my artistic deformities.
The girl, it's as though she wants something from death.
You have no idea how hard a life in art is.
They're rounding up Jewish men all over the city.
Jewish swine. Act like some drunkards. I'll find a way for us to be with, right? Charlotte. Welcome to France.
So much light.
Don't forget how you were raised. France declared war on Germany.
That's nice. Charlotte, it's nothing. I'm doing something mad to my house. I'm going to paint the story of my life. I don't know how much time I have.
Something like this before.
Beautiful and everything hideous.
For today, and be hopeful for tomorrow, which is what we are all doing here.
It's not that life loves us, but that we love life.
Fabulous. So if you didn't know anything about Charlotte, and if you didn't know anything about this film, and you just saw these roughly 2 minutes, you'd already realize, if you're astute, a number of things. You'd know that you're dealing with some very poignant story about a young girl during the Nazi period who is Jewish, who wanted to be an artist, whose mother, you might suppose, wasn't so sure that that's what she should be doing. It's just a bit of a hobby for her, but who ended up producing hundreds and hundreds, in fact, well over 1,000 works that conveyed her life. You'd recognize, if you were really watching quickly and carefully, the very title that comes at the end, Life or Theater, that of course you'd have to know German to know that, suggests the inclusion not just of visual art and not just text. You might not realize that every image has text that she added with it, but you have it at the very end written on the very back of what is Charlotte herself, painting by the seaside, but also theater. As one gets to see the story and the film, one realizes music is part of it. There are allusions in her texts to everyone from Beethoven to what would have been contemporary pop music that everyone in Germany certainly would have known in the 1920s and 30s. And of course, cinema becomes part of it by definition, because we have that medium as the medium that is now introducing us to her, and that medium filtered in different ways through a kind of unique series of lenses. You have an extraordinary array of actors and actresses who are voicing the different parts. You have a very skilled way in which Charlotte's art and her colors and her forms become the film in its colors and forms, this kind of synthesis. You have allusions to what in the film you'd see more clearly about her story, the relationship between love and death, an old theme, in fact, that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, but was particularly popular among the 19th century, 18th and 19th century German romantics, the whole idea of irony. And there are ironies that you can't even see that are beneath the surface, but in seeing the film, you might recognize. So having said all of this, the first obvious question to Julia Rosenberg is, why Charlotte's story? And it's okay, it's a nice story, but why this in particular, and directing it in this direction in particular, to do something animated? And obviously, my God, the energy, the effort, the love that went into producing this is extraordinary. Why'd you do it, Julia? Why'd you do it?
I have to say that your close reading of a film trailer is terrific. I wish that everyone read film trailers closely as you have. And thank you for all of the kind words you've already said about the film. Like many things, my initial impetus for making this film is sort of sentimental. I was given the book Life or Theater, the collection of Charlotte's work, for my 13th birthday. And half of my family is a Holocaust surviving family. And so as a 13-year-old girl, if one reads Life or Theater, it's very much a coming of age story of a young woman.
You were 13 when you read it.
Yes.
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
You'll share why that's significant.
I mean, so I for my bat mitzvah. So I got this book for my bat mitzvah, and I was an artsy 13-year-old who really identified with Charlotte, her alienation, both from her family, from her society, and her deep desire to overcome everything through a creative process. her sort of holding fast to the creative impetus as a way to make it through adversity, both intimate and familial adversity and contextual and socio-historical adversity. So her story spoke to me as a young woman. And then as I aged, it was quite a long time ago, so for 40 years ago, as I aged, I sort of considered the collection Life for Theater as a sort of a talisman. I would give it to men when I would fall in love with them and say, here, this is the most important thing in the world. So it's always been very close to my heart. And about 11 years ago, so I've been producing films for decades, live action films. And about 11 years ago, I was running one morning and the idea popped into my head that Charlotte drew her life story. And so I needed to produce a drawn version of her life story. And I didn't interrogate the impulse. I arrived home and before I took my shower, I sat down and Googled the Charlotte Salomon Foundation and sent off an email asking if the rights were available. And 11 years later, here we are. So it's one of those ideas that come to us that we don't interrogate and who take us on incredibly long, complex journeys.
Wow, fantastic. So Charlotte is 8 or 9 when her own mother dies. And if I'm not mistaken, she was 13 actually when formerly her father, and I may be off on this, but somehow I thought it was 5 years. She may have been 13 when her father actually married Paulina. I don't know if that, do you know off that?
I haven't done math. I mean,
Okay,
there's
somehow I think so, which would just make it an interesting coincidence.
Yeah. This having worked only in live action, I learned subsequently how different the process of producing animation is to producing live action. There are many stark differences. One of which is that the stories for animated films are sort of drawn in storyboards. They're scripted, but they're really put together in storyboard. But I developed this like I would a live action film with a writer many of, I would hope people on this call are somewhat familiar with. His name is David Bezmoskas. He's been a Radcliffe Fellow and twice nominated for the Giller Prize in Canada. He's principally a novelist and short story writer. And so we worked on the screenplay together for 4 years because there's quite a lot of adaptation from Charlotte's life for theater. There are many narrative, many aspects of the narrative of the original work that we have not included in the film.
Actually, that's a question I wanted to ask you. And so you're maybe I'm pushing you where you're already going anyway, because you did obviously, first of all, if anyone in that audience, in our audience who hasn't thought about this, let me just say, a film and a novel are not the same thing. So anytime you take a work of literature and transform it as a work of film, the filmmaker has to think of how to do things that will work for a film. I remember years and years ago when Thomas Mann's Death in Venice was made into a film with Dirk Bogarde. And the filmmaker radically transformed it. In fact, Van Aschenbach in the novella is a writer and he becomes a conductor-composer. So everyone figures, oh, it's kind of loosely based on Mahler. And at first I was offended about that. And then I thought about, no, he has transformed this radically to make his own kind of film statement. Well, you didn't do that, but you clearly chose stuff to leave out. You chose, for example, to have the young, and it turns out he's not so young, he's probably 20 years older than she, her first relationship, who is the guy who's working with her stepmother, who is a singer. You chose to give him not the name that she tends to use, which is, what do you call it, Daberlon, in her work, but rather the name of the actual fellow on whom this was based, Alfred Wolfson. So I was curious about the choices of what you left out and what you transformed relative to what she had sort of put in writing, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, it's a great question. We had to decide if we were doing a strict adaptation of Life for Theater, or if we were doing a biopic of Charlotte Salomon, who made Life for Theater. And we opted to do a biopic of Charlotte Salomon, who made Life for Theater.
Got it.
What complicated that is, in terms of source material, we principally have Life for Theater, and we have some biographical details. For instance, in Life for Theater, there's very little about her life in France, but a third of our film is her life in France. In Life for Theater, she imagines that her first boyfriend is also in love with her stepmother. And for narrative reasons, we thought, well, it seems like a bit of a distraction. That seems like a metaphor, an idea. We were always asking ourselves the question, in concert with the Charlotte Salomon Foundation, by the way, with whom we work very closely, what is true? When you make a film about someone who perishes in Auschwitz, it's quite important ethically was for us to try to represent things as true. A little aside, the only scene we completely made up or speculated might have happened was her visit to the Degenerate Art Show.
Yes.
She doesn't represent that in her work, but she's an art student in Berlin. It's still on record as the most attended art show in the history of museums. So we figured she went. Anyway, so we thought, okay, we want to represent things as truthfully as we can. But we were also confounded by Charlotte herself, because she calls her work life or theater. So at the heart of her memoir, it's also a work of testimony. She's in exile in France, remembering Berlin. So at the heart of all of that, she is herself as a conceptual artist, not just someone who draws, but as an artist in the full sense of the world, who's also thinking about the form and thinking about representation and truth. What is true? The first boyfriend survived the war in London and continued to work on expanding his theories about the voice and the role of the voice in creativity. And he denied that he ever had a sexual relationship with her.
Interesting.
Scholars and the foundation think, well, he did that to protect himself because she was quite young and he was much older.
Right.
But there's also a very famous art historian, Griselda Pollock, who speculates that the grandfather was a sexual predator.
Right.
So I think Charlotte encourages us to think about what is true and what is not true, what's representation that's direct and interpreted. It's all part of the work.
Fantastic. I actually have three specific questions following up on this. One regarding Wolfson / derailing, the first boyfriend, and whether, because apparently he was quite the ladies' man, whether there was evidence that he actually had a fiancée at that time, or is that an interjection on your part, which obviously worked dramatically regardless? And two, or I'll repeat if you forget the three that I'm offering you. Two, you chose not to emphasize the ways in which she recalls her what I like to call her Christmas tree childhood, a very typically very assimilated Reform Jewish childhood, literally, with the celebration of Christmas and so on, so that her Jewish identity was not a function of synagogue attendance, that's for sure. And three, I did find it interesting because it shows how up-to-date your research was, that in her own account, there's nothing about her poisoning her grandfather, but we get it by way of a letter that apparently she wrote and sent to, and it shows up later. But the interesting thing is she writes the letter not with ordinary everyday handwriting, but in that same sort of painted handwriting that she used throughout her work, as if it was part of it. It wasn't part of it, but it was part of it. So I just find that fascinating. And of course, you did not go as close to the precipice as to suggest that he was a sexual predator, but he was certainly not only nasty enough, but he'd sustained a really bad fall. And he seemed to suggest anyway that he was ready to die, so that it did not make her seem like someone who was horrible, a monster, because she did that. So I'm just curious about those three particular elements. Did I give you four?
Yeah, that's okay.
I don't count very well. That's okay. Up to two, I'm great, and then I lose track.
Remind me of the first one, please.
The first one had to do with derailing / Wolfson and the fiancée.
So he has a fiancée in Life for Theater, and her name is Babette.
I've forgotten that, I guess. My fault. Okay.
That's fine. So that's directly from, and we had many scenes in Life for Theater. He actually comes for dinner with Babette, and Charlotte's there, and we had all these scenes where they were talking. They were wonderful scenes, but we realized it was too complicated, and we were doing all of Charlotte's life, so we opted not to do that. So that's the response.
Well, I thought what you did with it was perfect, and the timing you know, it's sort of this confrontation, and then the Nazis show up. I mean, it was perfect.
Yeah, we didn't have to dwell too much on that.
Right. Second was her childhood.
Jewishness. Well, her childhood and her Jewishness. Oh no, second was her childhood. So
Right.
this is something that happens in a lot of adaptations, especially of biopics. I find the beginning of the film already a little episodic, and I sort of wish it was a little less episodic. But if we had started with her childhood, it would be even more episodic. And we thought it was more important to introduce her relationship with her mother in the opening title sequence, and that she sort of had a relationship of yearning with this mother, than it was to show the Christmas tree. Also, we had to ask ourselves, we had to take a position on how informed we thought the audience would be on the Second World War. And we decided that because it's a film primarily for adults and maybe older teenagers, that they would have some knowledge. So Charlotte was not very Jewish identified. And Paula brought that into her life. And in the same way, the rise of the Nazis is not central to the film, in that there are flags and there are people saying Heil Hitler, but it wasn't at the core of what Charlotte was experiencing. We also sort of have that with her Jewishness.
Yeah.
So it wasn't.
And by the way, the Nazi imagery in those 1,000 gouaches, the percentage that actually focus on that is very small, even though that's such an important factor, obviously, in everything.
Well, we were talking a little bit about, you know, the pity of it all, but you know, the Jewish communities, especially the one that, you know, her father was a surgeon and a professor, her stepmother's an opera singer, they were very, very assimilated. So, and we know that Germany had been through a lot of turmoil, so they were normalized. Anyway, it's a whole other conversation about how the German Jews perceived the rise of the Nazis in different communities. And then the last thing you touched on was the poisoning of her grandfather. And when I started this project, that information was not public. And so you can imagine from a producer's point of view, in terms of telling the story of someone, that changed everything. And my understanding is, so if you look at the end of life of theater, Charlotte has pages and pages and pages of painted text.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that when her stepmother and father gave the collection to the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam, Paula took these pages out because she didn't want to tarnish the reputation of Charlotte.
Mm-hmm.
A Dutch filmmaker named Frans Weiss, who made a live action biopic in the 80s that is so-so, was hired by the Charlotte Salomon Foundation to produce a documentary on Charlotte in 2017, because it was the 100th anniversary of her birth. When he was making the biopic, he went with the production secretary to interview Paula, and she told him about these pages, and the production secretary transcribed them. And I don't remember exactly why he wasn't allowed to talk about them until a certain point, but I think they made a deal that he wouldn't talk about them until a certain point. And I guess that point had arrived. And so he included that information in this documentary he made in 2017, which is why we included it in our film.
Wow. Yeah, no, and it's wow, it's very strong. Which leads me to another question, by the way. How did you get access to the wonderful documentary interview footage that comes as an epilogue to the epilogue, you know, at the end, including, of course, her surviving father and stepmother, and they're being interviewed, obviously much older, but.
I remember seeing that footage at Yad Vashem, because they actually had it, and it was an interview conducted by, I think it's WDR, one of the German public broadcasters, and we had almost finished the film, and a colleague who was involved in the film said, "Are there any images of Charlotte with her art?" And the idea just came to me. I said, "No, but there's this incredible documentary footage," and so we cut it in, and there you have it. So we licensed the footage from WDR.
Fabulous! I think it works wonderfully.
Yeah, it changes things, doesn't it? It reminds you that this is indeed a true story.
Right, exactly. And I suppose, and I'm obviously not the first person to say this, the idea of the surviving parent or parents or father and stepmother editing what they then hand over to the museum, of course, recalls Otto Frank, and what at some point is realized, but presumably not initially, that Anne Frank's diary, when it's handed over, has been edited a bit, although it's different sorts of material that he has left out, which I also found interesting. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I'm just concurring. Like, I think that, I mean, I had a very small taste of this. In telling the story of someone who dies so young in the Shoah, one does feel a certain responsibility to not only tell the truth, but people who know Charlotte Salomon's work, the attachment is almost fierce, and you do want her to be beloved and admired, and so I think that the impulse is quite natural. And then also as upper class German Jews, I would think that they also were trying to protect an image of their daughter.
Yeah.
And in terms of the moment of the poisoning, it did present a challenge for us because, you know, as Professor Pollack postulates, she thought, well, the motivation for that is revenge for him being a predator. But we weren't as certain that that really was what was behind it. And so we needed to present it in a way which is quite unusual in film storytelling, which is an ambiguous, it's an ambiguous moment in the film. And usually one knows what one wishes to convey. And so for some people, it's a mercy killing because yes, he's fallen and hit his head. He's also just been beaten up because he's Jewish. There's a proclamation saying the Jews have to report. He says, so there's that. He says earlier in the film, I've brought poison, so I can always live with dignity. So it's many levels. She's doing what she thinks he would wish.
Mm-hmm.
And I would, if they weren't refugees in wartime, I doubt that she would have poisoned her grandmother. So I think the argument that she does it out of some sort of personal vengeance doesn't hold as much water.
Right.
That being said, he's horrible to her.
Right.
So it's quite an interesting dramatic situation where you're putting someone out of their misery whom you also have a lot of complicated feelings for.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And I think among other things that are interesting about these choices that you made and the term ambiguity that you use is that just as the form of your film is consistent with the form of Charlotte's work, and by that I mean the way in which, in a very literal sense, her work comes alive on the screen in front of the viewer, and the world around her work comes alive before the viewer. I love what you guys did with that, but also in terms of content, among the many, 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 many things that one could say, one is ambiguity, because her whole work has all kinds of ambiguities. And so you have teased that out in a very particularized kind of manner. Even you said this earlier on, the whole question of whether she really did or didn't have a sexual relationship with Wolfson. I gather her initial attraction for her stepmother, who is drop dead gorgeous apparently, and very a strong personality, the opposite of Charlotte, who was so shy apparently. There was an attraction there, which she would have been even too young to realize was sexual, but which in our hypersensitive era, we might look at that way, but it's ambiguous. It's ambiguous.
I mean, in Life for Theater, at some points, I wondered whether she was attracted to Paula. I mean, there's
exactly.
one
No, that's what I'm saying. Exactly.
Yeah, one can psychoanalyze. The work of adaptation is really about trying to figure out what's at the heart of the story. So that's what we determined was at the heart of the story, was her coming of age, her awakenings, artistic. It was more important to us that Wolfson, though a cad and a liar, is the only one who takes her seriously as a young artist. And that was very familiar to me and to other creative women that I know, that often the men we were interested in, that's the most important thing. It doesn't, nothing else has really mattered, but are you taking me seriously?
Are you taking me seriously? Yeah. 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 I think you're absolutely right there. And Wolfson definitely gets 2 points for that recognition. There was something else I wanted to ask you. Oh, yes, I know. Another moment, and you mentioned it in passing, because I think it's important also of ambiguity. That image that you show, even in the trailer, that is a key image in her work, which is when Hitler has come to power, January 3rd, 1933, and the backward swastika on the Nazi flag, and all the stormtroopers, and the commentary that she offers, which is a rather negative comment on Jews who at that time were there in the crowd applauding Hitler as he came along. And my thinking about that, and so I want your feedback, because you dealt with it. You know, on the one hand, she's sort of just kind of quoting the German view of Jews. On the other hand, it could be her view, but of course, she's doing this in 1941, 1942, when it's very clear where Hitler was going with the Jews. And it's a truism of the vast majority of German Jews that by 1933, they still were not convinced that he was going to be as horrific as he ended up being, because German Jewry had had bad moments going back for decades, which would be followed by a resumption of good moments. They're part of the center of culture, but they're getting spat at, all that sort of stuff. So one can imagine, without aftersight, that if I'm there then, I'm hoping, because also, just as we want heroes, we hope for the best. It can happen to us, that they're hoping that it's a bad phase and it's going to be passed over and things will get back to where they were. Any thoughts about that, or thoughts about Charlotte's thoughts about that? Because obviously you thought about it.
I mean, I think it's important. So the film, the story is told sequentially in the film.
Right.
But Charlotte tells her story retrospectively
Right.
in Life for Theater. It's also a work of an artist in exile. I'm wondering if she'll ever see these streets again. And you feel that attention to detail. And, you know, our film begins with the brown shirts coming into the opera, and Charlotte telling the older people, come on, take this seriously. And they're all full of denial, and she's just coping with it. So I always sensed a certain frustration on her part that her family wasn't responding quicker and more seriously to what was happening.
Yeah.
But that's my speculation entirely.
Yeah, but I agree with you. I mean, and that would be consistent also with the other kinds of frustrations she must have been feeling as a young person with these old people, you know, from being recognized, not recognized as an artist, to everything else, you know?
Sure. And you know, I recently showed the film to a friend of mine who's a very famous Canadian photographer named Edward Bertinsky, who's of Ukrainian origin.
Yes.
And it took him quite a bit of time to sort of get up at the end of the film and for us to then go and have a bite to eat. But he was just so overwhelmed with the depiction of having to flee one's country and being a refugee. And there's so many aspects to this film that are so particularly resonant right now.
Yeah. I mean, the ironies from the fact, and this was not in the film because as we know, you couldn't put everything in, the fact that Paulina was singing in churches and they loved her singing as if she was the best Christian singer on the planet. The irony there, or the irony that she ends up sent away by her parents for refuge with her grandparents, who are echt Deutsche Juden, you know, true German Jews, remember where you come from, etc., their grandfather, and really against their will decide they need to leave for a while, so they go to the south of France. But of course, her parents send her there to be with them. They're in Ottilie's hospitality, but she's essentially with her grandparents, and her grandfather is, from beginning to end, is so nasty to her. And her grandmother is very clearly slipping down that slope. So the refuge, as far as the grandparents and her relationship is concerned, is hardly a refuge. And of course, in the end, her parents managed to get to Amsterdam and ultimately go into hiding and survive, where she does not. It's just tragic, although I wonder about that also, Julia. You know, you're not only episodic. I love the way we learn how her mother actually died as she learned, because she was always told, oh, influenza. And then eventually,
yes.
right?
Yeah, no, the point of view is the story is Charlotte's, right?
Yeah,
There's
so
almost never a scene where Charlotte's not there. So the story is, I think we break it once or twice, and I don't remember now, but I used to remember. And it's interesting, though, talking about refuge and how effective that refuge was. Ultimately, it was ineffective, although it gave her time to make her masterpiece. It's so remarkable that Charlotte, many think, made the first graphic novel as a refugee in the south of France. The volume of, I have a very good friend of mine, another friend who's a painter named Margot Williamson, and the thing that painters have remarked upon is the volume of work.
Yeah.
To make so much work, even as you know, in a studio in Chelsea, in Manhattan, you know, with
Right,
a
under
big
the best
gallery behind you.
circumstances, yeah.
So it's astounding what Charlotte was able to make in the conditions that she had.
Yeah, it really was. I wonder too, you know, and in that interview at the end, the off-cam interviewer asks her father, do you think she would have been doomed in any case? And he says, no, of course not. And it is interesting that her sense of her own potential doom, given the fate of her mother, the fate of her aunt for whom she was named, the fate of her grandmother, all of whom are suicides. And then we get to her at the end, she's 5 months pregnant. No, backtrack from that. She and Alex decide to get married officially. I mean, how crazy can that be? They cannot not realize the implications of going, presenting themselves. She is a Jew, he is a non-Jew, and then he says, no, I am a Jew. Either way, it's bad news bears. They have written their death certificates at that point. So it's only a question of when they're going to show up at the door and haul them away. Do you think, or not? See, ambiguity. That's why I'm asking.
So I don't think so. I don't think they knew. You know, just because they were rounding up the Jews, it didn't mean that they would round up the Jews. It doesn't mean they'd round up all of the Jews. Like they were definitely putting themselves in a more dangerous position. And, you know, Alexander was Jewish. He just had fake papers.
Right.
And I don't know, but I assume that it was more important for him to be hopeful in that moment, and they've been living quite well in a way. Like
yes,
it was 1943, right? Eichmann
right.
only started rounding up the Jews from Italy and Hungary, and that part of France was overseen by the Italians, which is why there were 35,000 Jews there, which is a huge amount. So I think we don't know how risky that was. It seems very risky to us, but we're not entirely sure that they would have thought it to be as risky.
Yeah, that's why I asked you. You see, I knew you'd have a good response to that. And she was shocked when he owned up to being Jewish in your film. I mean, the way you present
yes,
that.
Of course.
Yeah.
Oh, because it's riskier.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean it's not necessarily a death sentence. I'm not sure they would have thought it was a death sentence. But it was riskier. I think that's why she gave her work to the doctor for safekeeping. But it's for me, one of the hardest moments in the film is when she decides not to leave with Ottilie and the kids.
Yes, because they both could have left. And do you suppose that has anything to do with a sense still of obligation to her grandparents?
Yes. So when we were thinking through her motivation in terms of the film, we thought it was a combination of the how she was raised. She wouldn't abandon her grandfather, even though he's horrible.
Right.
She's in the middle of the project of her life, which also has an impact on that moment when she learns she's pregnant. She's not overjoyed. She's only she warms to the idea when she sees how happy Alexander is.
Yes.
So she's involved in the work of her life. She's this massive project, and she's caring for her grandfather. That's why we think she stayed behind.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. It certainly seems that way. Wow. What else can you tell us?
I don't. But lots of things. It's yeah. There's so much in this story. There's mental illness. There's an overlooked female artist. There's thinking about being a refugee. There's her Jewishness. There's anti-Semitism, discrimination. there's so much that people can take from it. Our biggest challenge was to really just focus on the dramatic shape of her coming of age and her birth, the birth of an artist.
Yeah.
And everything that we thought that went into that.
Yeah, indeed. And you did a spectacular job of presenting that. To come back full circle to where my first question and the first part of your answer, you know, your bat mitzvah. So the bat mitzvah is that coming of age ritual within the Jewish tradition, which of course was only a bar mitzvah until the 1920s, when Mordechai M. Kaplan created a Reconstructionist Judaism, whereafter bat mitzvah also became legit, meaning that for the first time in Jewish history, a certain level of recognition of female and not just male transitioning from childhood to adulthood with all of the promise and responsibility thereunto appertaining is achieved in some quarters, at least, of the Jewish world. So I think it's sort of fantastic that this project is really percolating in you as you are in the process of that transition. And when you finally get to it, it's all of those pinpoint aspects of that transition. A comment you made a bit earlier about the decision on the part of her father and stepmother to leave certain things out of the package they handed over to the museum, the same Otto Frank vis-a-vis Anna Frank. I think it's also part of, as you said, you know, she's got fans that who are really fierce. They want her to be perfect. We want our heroes to be perfect. And one of the things I like about the hero idea, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, is that none of our heroes is perfect. The hero of heroes, Moses, has a temper, the outcome and consequence of which is he doesn't get to enter the promised land. But all of the heroes and heroines have clay feet. They're never allowed to be pedestalized to the point where they could be even vaguely divinized. And yet, as a species, and that includes Jews, we want our heroes to be perfect. I'm very content, you know, with Charlotte's potential imperfections, as I am with Anna Frank's, but I understand the motivation not to allow them to be imperfect. And I feel that you played with that very effectively.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think there's another layer to that,
Please.
Which is that I think Jewish communities were so punctually persecuted, as you said, that they also were worried about depicting themselves as blemished because they were already contesting with wiping off the mud being thrown on them, just to extend a metaphor ridiculously. Sure. So I also think that there was a sort of collective concern about how we are perceived by non-Jews. Mm-hmm. And it's important that we are as perfect as possible. Sort of what we hear from people now from racialized communities in the workforce, who feel like they have to be better and stronger than their counterparts because of prejudice from the outset. So I think that adds something to the natural desire to protect those we love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree. Well, I think maybe we might open this up to questions from our audience. What do you think? You up for that?
Sure. I am up for it.
All right. Rachel, are you going to supervise the questions in the chat and whatever is coming forward and share them with us? And we'll see what we can do with them. And you have to unmute yourself, though, of course.
Yes, of course. I'm happy to. Thank you so much. I mean, I have a question myself. Like, how did you gather that team to realize your vision? Like, who did you like? How did that process?
Including the actors and actresses, quite an array.
Yes, exactly. And why animation? Like, how did? I mean, you said because she created this graphic novel, so that this was the decision to really stay within the same medium. But could you talk a little bit about your process there?
Oh, sure. So I having made films for a few decades now, I was familiar with various screenwriters. So I worked with screenwriters that I've worked with before, and we worked on the screenplay. And then from there, I needed to find someone who'd produced animation before. So I found a wonderful woman who had produced animation for 20 years, and she became my sort of partner in arms. And then we went looking for studios and looking for directors and assembled the team, and the studios had animators, and we also hired some other animators. And it is an industry that functions, so we sort of walked into the industry that functions. In terms of getting the level of cast, I think that's usually a combination of the quality of the screenplay, because that is how the actors evaluate whether or not they wish to participate, is by reading the screenplay. And David Besmos is a particularly talented writer. His screenplay was tremendous, so that helped. And I think also the fact that I've made movies before, and people, the agents could look at who is making this and have a sense as to how it might turn out, or what my priorities are as a producer, or my ability to finance and pay and all of that stuff. And then also we worked with a casting director, which is normal, and casting directors have ongoing, very strong relationships with agents and managers. And we worked with a wonderful woman in the UK who really helped with that. I will say though that people said yes very quickly, were paid very little, and everyone, I think ultimately, everyone across the board was moved by Charlotte's story. So none of us did this to make a film, although we were happy to make a film. We did this to bring Charlotte's story and her work to a wider audience. It was an easy motivation for us.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, I have a question about the idea of the graphic novel, because the first graphic novel, which was The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, was published in 1842. Mind you, it's a much simpler and black and white, obviously, story, and much simpler than this is, full tilt boogie, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of drawings and text. So can you parse that for me?
Not sufficiently.
Okay.
I'm not enough of a scholar to do it, but I would say that she probably was a pioneer more in the graphic memoir than the graphic novel, but I think I'm parsing there too.
Well, I agree with your parsing. Cool, fine, done. Next question.
I have a question about the opera, about the opera music aspect, because in her original vision, her piece was designed as an opera with music assigned, like a very complex thing, really, that probably would have been too complex to perform in many ways, because she had language, music, and art overlap each other. So how did you deal with that aspect, or did you focus?
We admired it conceptually, but opted to use music more as a tool for cinema. And also some of her choices were very more like operetta than they were actually opera. And so we just scored the film with a wonderfully talented composer from Belgium. And
And by the way, very effectively. I don't have to tell you, you're a filmmaker. Music is so essential. I mean, John Williams turns 90 this year, right? The films that have been improved by the music that he contributes, I don't have to tell you. I thought you guys did a great job with your use of music.
Well, the soundtrack is available on Spotify. Sony released the soundtrack digitally worldwide, so I encourage you all to get the soundtrack, as well as renting and buying the film on iTunes. It's all available to you and for you to enjoy over and over again. I've tagged it on my Spotify playlist, and I listen to it all the time. I think he's a tremendous talent.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, you definitely assembled a really strong team there, which and you can feel that everybody was really devoted to the story and bringing the story to the public, and in a different way, because Charlotte seems to, her life seems to interest people again and again and again, and there are new viewpoints coming really all the time, right? So the different perspectives and so on. So yeah, we have a lot of questions here where the film is available, and so I keep putting that information in the chat function, but we also will send out a follow-up email tomorrow where you will have, where you will get the information. So Tanya is asking whether you had any feedback reviews from young women or other young people, late teens, young adults. How do they respond to your film?
Young women they love it. It's really exciting for me to talk to young women who've seen it, as young as 13, 14, 15, early 20s. We don't have as many films as we think about young creative women, and so it speaks volumes to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was a question in the chat about your choice to go with British rather than American kinds of accents. Was that conscious, or just played out that way, or?
Of course it was conscious.
Of course.
But it's an old trope. It's they should be speaking German. So what we often do in cinema, if there are people who should be speaking a language other than English and they're European, is we give them British accents.
Which makes sense.
It's as simple as that.
Right.
It's a convention.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a second question about the liberty that you felt with an animated film rather than some other form, an action kind of film that you've done before. What kind of constraints on the one hand or liberty on the other did you feel you had? Freedom.
Sorry about this truck pulling up behind me. I hope it's not too noisy. I was saying earlier, I'm location scouting a new film, so I'm can everyone still hear me? Is it okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. It's a great question about liberty. So what's incredible about animation is that in some ways it's pure filmmaking, because it's entirely creative. There's nothing you see on the screen that's there by chance. You're not shooting something in an existing location. Someone's not having to wear their own t-shirt. Every single thing you see in here is created. So we had total liberty to do what we thought was best.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah, amazing. You mentioned, I read somewhere that the animation is really created only at the very end, after the long process of the writing and choosing actors and all that. So I thought that was very interesting. And is the process, like, how does that process work of creating the animation? Is is that like still like in the olden days where you had to pull so many different frames that until the figure is moving, or is that more animated now and now more computer generated? Like, how does that work?
Well, I think it's a two-part question. So the first part is the order of events, and animation itself is very expensive. So you can't just sort of animate a sequence and then make changes and make changes and make changes. So what you do instead is you edit together storyboards, and that those edited together storyboards are called an animative. And you have basically the position of the camera and how long you hold a shot, a change of expression. And so you lock the film in these storyboards. And to keep in mind that, you may have 10 storyboard artists. So Charlotte is not always consistently drawn. It's quite a challenging thing to look at. And then once that is done, while that is being done, you have your characters who are designed and your backgrounds are designed. And then you take your designed characters and you animate them, and then you draw the backgrounds, and eventually you put them in the background.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much the process.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, there are some sequences, like when her grandmother tries to hang herself, that was done classically, which is frame by frame. It's not on paper anymore, it's drawn on the computer, but it is still frame by frame.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the film is done with, it's called assisted 2D. So it's done with a computer where we have a bunch of key poses. We move the sort of the puppet into poses, and the movement from one pose to the other is somewhat is automated.
Mhm.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. Huh. Wonderful. So Tanya is asking, is this why it was episodic, as you said earlier? I might have misunderstood this.
Oh, no. When I said episodic, I meant when you, the truck is finally pulled away. When you try to tell someone's whole life story, even in the case of someone who died so young as Charlotte did, you feel compelled to sort of, this episode happened, and then this episode happened, and then this episode happened. But when you tell a story well, you don't have that sense of chapters. You have the sense of the story flowing from one movement to the next. So that's what I meant by episodic. I was being critical of the film for a minute there.
Right. Okay, Tanya said I got it.
Yes. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so much, Ori, for this enlightening conversation. I learned a lot about animated film and certainly about your film, and I'm looking forward to watch it again after all this additional information. So thank you so much, Julia and Ori, for taking the time. And I hope to see everyone soon again. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very nice
Yeah.
chatting, Ori. It was a lovely
Pleasure.
conversation.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.